The inspection hall smelled faintly of floor polish and starched fabric, the kind of scent every soldier in training learned to associate with discipline. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp white beams onto the long rows of young recruits standing rigidly in formation. Boots gleamed, brass buttons caught the light, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Private Elena Ramirez stood in the third row, her back straight, shoulders square, chin lifted. She had practiced her stance in the barracks mirror until her muscles screamed. Every line of her uniform was pressed to precision, every detail carefully attended to. She knew inspections were as much about bearing as about neatness. One misplaced fold, one stray hair, one nervous twitch, it could all undo weeks of effort. She inhaled deeply, steadying her heartbeat. Her pulse wanted to race, but she refused to let it. The commander, Captain Hayes, was already moving down the first row. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of presence that made the air seem thinner around him. Rumors among the recruits described him as both exacting and unpredictable. He could bark thunder for the smallest mistake, or nod with silent approval for perfection. Nobody ever quite knew what would trigger which response. That unpredictability kept everyone on edge. Elena had heard stories of recruits reduced to tears under his stare. Some were ordered to repeat drills for hours because their boots weren't polished to standard. Others had been sent back to their bunks to start all over, uniforms stripped and laid out wrong. She didn't intend to be one of them. Her squad mates shifted subtly, though all were supposed to be statues. She could sense their nerves. A quick swallow here, a twitching jaw there. Elena, however, had trained herself to control even the smallest fidget. Growing up, she had been taught that strength wasn't about loud declarations, but about quiet steadiness. That lesson had carried her through the grueling weeks of training. The commander moved steadily closer. Each step of his boots echoed, like a drumbeat, marking the tension in the room. He inspected collars, tugged at sleeves, tapped at boots with the edge of his finger. His sharp eyes caught everything. By the time he reached Elena's row, the room felt like it was holding its breath. She could feel the faint prick of sweat at the back of her neck, but kept her gaze fixed forward. Private Ramirez, the commander's voice cut through the silence. "Yes, sir," she replied firmly, her voice even. He circled her slowly, his gaze sweeping over every inch of her uniform. He paused at her collar, adjusted the angle of her insignia by a fraction, then stepped back. "Polish?" he asked. "Completed, sir." He nodded once, his eyes flicking to her boots, which shone so brightly they almost reflected his face. He gave no comment, which, among recruits, was considered a compliment. For a moment, it seemed Elena would pass through the inspection without incident. Relief threatened to creep in, but she pushed it away. Discipline meant not celebrating. Early, then something shifted. The commander stepped behind her, his eyes narrowing. He leaned slightly, studying the space just above her pressed blouse, where the collar ended and her spine disappeared beneath the fabric. A shadow of ink peeked through, faint but visible under the fluorescent light. His steps slowed, his silence dragging. The recruits in the room stiffened further. Inspections were strict about grooming and appearance, and while tattoos weren't forbidden, their meaning and placement often carried weight. Alana's breath caught in her chest. She had almost forgotten it might show when she stood so tall, when her blouse shifted against her skin. The tattoo wasn't large, but its lines were sharp, the curve of wings and the edge of Roman numerals etched into her back. She had carried it for years, hidden beneath clothes, only occasionally seen by those closest to her. The commander did not speak at first. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. His silence stretched long enough for tension to ripple across the hall. Even the buzzing lights seemed louder. Finally, his voice came, quieter than before, but no less commanding. Private Ramirez. Sir, what does that mark mean? Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had prepared herself for endless drills, for criticism of her uniform, for any number of military demands. She had not prepared for this. Every soldier in the hall waited. They weren't just waiting for her response. They were waiting to see how the commander would react. His pause wasn't the pause of disapproval. Not yet. It was curiosity, but curiosity from a man who never wasted words. Elena kept her eyes fixed forward, her jaw set. She could feel the weight of memory pressing at her chest, memories she rarely spoke aloud. The tattoo had a story, one she had lived, one that was carved into her as deeply as the ink itself. And now, standing under the sharp lights of the inspection hall, that story was no longer hers alone. The silence after the commander's question stretched across the inspection hall like a drawn bowstring. Soldiers who had been staring straight ahead now burned with curiosity, though their eyes never dared move. To them, Captain Hayes was a storm, sudden, powerful, and unrelenting. If he had paused at Ramirez's back, there had to be a reason. Elena stood motionless, though inside, her body wanted to betray her. The tattoo wasn't rebellion, wasn't art for art's sake. It was a memorial. But explaining that in front of 100 soldiers under inspection felt like exposing her very heartbeat. Hayes's boots shifted, the sound echoing. He stepped closer, just enough that the faint shadow of ink became unmistakable. His hand lifted, hesitated, then fell back to his side. He would never touch a recruit without reason, but his eyes traced the outline with clinical precision. An eagle, wings outstretched, Roman numerals beneath. The soldiers closest to Elena could see it too. A tattoo on the spine wasn't typical. It wasn't hidden rebellion on an ankle, or a simple phrase on a wrist. It carried intent. Private. Hayes said again, his voice lower now, though still sharp enough to cut through the tension. I'll ask once more. What does it mean? Elena inhaled carefully. She wanted to speak, to tell the story, but the rules of inspection battled with the weight of her past. Speaking out of turn, especially in formation, was risky. Yet remaining silent under a direct question was worse. She chose her words with care. Sir, it is a personal memorial. That answer could have ended it. Many commanders would have left it there, chalking it up to private business, moving on with the inspection. But Hayes didn't. He narrowed. His eyes, his expression unreadable, and then stepped around to face her again. Personal, he repeated, almost testing the word. His gaze locked with hers. You're aware that when you wear this uniform, nothing about your bearing is. Entirely personal. Everything you carry reflects on your unit, your service, and your country. Yes, sir, Elena answered without hesitation. For the first time, there was a flicker, not of fear, but of something deeper. She wanted to hold on to the memory, privately, but she also knew she couldn't diminish its meaning with a shallow response. Hayes studied her a moment longer. Then, to the surprise of everyone present, he turned to the entire hall. Eyes front, he barked. Nobody moves. His voice thundered, and like statues, every soldier stiffened again. He returned his focus to Elena, his expression calm but firm. Private Ramirez, he said, softer now, so only those closest could truly hear, though the silence made his words echo. You'll explain. Elena swallowed hard. She had carried the story like a folded letter inside her chest, one that never saw the light of day unless she chose. To tell it here felt both terrifying and necessary. Her father's face rose in her memory, the way he used to lace his boots in the morning, his laughter after long shifts, the way he carried himself, even on the hardest days, and the way the family never saw him return from deployment. The eagle had been his favorite emblem, Strength isn't about winning, he had told her once. It's about carrying weight, even when you don't think you can. The Roman numerals beneath were etched with the date his unit had been ambushed. Overseas. He hadn't survived. Elena had been 15. That memory pressed against her throat like a stone. She inhaled slowly. "Sir," she began, her voice steady despite the ache rising in her chest. "It represents my father. He served before me. He didn't come home." Hayes's face didn't change, but his eyes softened. He didn't interrupt. "The eagle," Elena continued, "was what he always carried. He told me once that an eagle's wings are wide enough to shield others even while they fight their own battles. I had it marked on me, so I'd carry him with me every day, even under the uniform." Her words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. The silence in the hall deepened. Soldiers who had once been terrified of Hayes's wrath now felt a new weight pressing on their chests. It wasn't fear. It was respect. Hayes finally stepped back, his arms folding behind his back. His jaw worked as though he was choosing his next words carefully. "Elena Ramirez," he said, deliberately using her full name, something he rarely did during inspection. "Your father's service is honored here, and so is the way you carry his memory." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with sharp precision, he turned on his heel and raised his voice. "Inspection continues." The hall seemed to breathe again, but nothing was quite the same. The air had shifted, charged not with fear, but with a quiet reverence. Every soldier now looked at Ramirez differently, though their eyes stayed forward. She had spoken of sacrifice, of loss, of strength, things every one of them knew hovered behind the uniform, though rarely said aloud. Hayes moved down the line, inspecting the next recruit, his tone as sharp and exact as before. But the pause at Ramirez's back had changed the rhythm of the day. Elena stood still, her face forward, her heart heavy, yet strangely lighter. She hadn't intended to reveal that piece of herself here, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by boots and crisp uniforms. Yet, in doing so, she felt something she hadn't in years. Her father's legacy wasn't just hers anymore. It had been witnessed. And for the first time in her military journey, she felt not only like a soldier, but like part of something far larger. The inspection pressed on as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet every soldier in the hall knew something had shifted. The tension had been replaced by a thick silence that seemed to carry Elena's words in its very air. Even the echo of the commander's boots on the polished floor rang differently, like they struck against the weight of her story. Elena kept her gaze forward, her muscles locked in place. Outwardly, she looked the same as before. Shoulders squared, chin high, uniform perfect. But inside, her heart still pounded. Speaking her father's story aloud in this space had felt both like a burden lifted and a vulnerability exposed. She hadn't planned to share it. She hadn't even thought she could. Yet when the commander asked, there had been no other choice. Behind her, she could sense her squadmates' presence like a row of shadows. They hadn't shifted, not even an inch, but she knew they had heard. She wondered what they thought, pity, admiration, or simply relief it hadn't been them. The military didn't encourage displays of emotion, but everyone carried their own ghosts. Hers had just been named. Captain Hayes inspected 2 more recruits before pausing again, his gaze cutting briefly back toward Elena as though to check if she remained steady. She did. He gave no further comment and moved on, his voice clipped as he issued small corrections. A sleeve folded incorrectly, a belt slightly askew. But even his tone carried a subtle change, not softer exactly, but weighted. For Elena, every second stretched long. She focused on her breathing. Slow inhale, steady exhale. Her father had once told her that in the field, panic killed faster than bullets. Calm was armor. She had repeated that lesson endlessly during training, but today it had taken on new meaning. She remembered the day she had gotten the tattoo. The shop had been small, tucked away on the edge of town, its walls covered with sketches of symbols and animals. She had been 18, barely old enough to sign the consent form without a guardian. The artist had looked at her carefully when she showed him the design. "Back piece?" he had asked. "Between the shoulder blades," she'd replied. He had studied the eagle she had drawn on paper, the Roman numerals beneath it. Military? "My father was," she said simply. The artist hadn't asked more. He just nodded, his voice quiet. "This one's heavy. You sure you want to carry it there?" "Yes," she'd answered, without hesitation. The pain had been sharp, burning down her spine, but she had refused to flinch. With every line etched into her skin, she had felt her father closer. By the time it was finished, she had known she would never regret it. Now, years later, that ink had been seen by the one man in her unit whose approval could make or break her career. Instead of reprimand, he had listened. A sound pulled her back to the present, the slam of Hayes's boots as he pivoted at the end of the line. "Company," he barked. The soldiers snapped to attention, the echo resounding like a single strike of thunder. "Inspection complete." The formal phrase usually ended in a litany of corrections, but today Hayes paused. His eyes swept across the formation, landing briefly on Elena before moving on. "Overall satisfactory," he said. "Some improvements needed, but discipline is holding." He let the words sink in, then added, "Dismissed." The command released them. The soldiers broke formation in unison, their boots scuffing against the floor as they turned sharply. Conversations usually erupted quickly after dismissal, laughter mixing with relief. But today, the air remained hushed, as though the silence from earlier had followed them out of formation. Elena moved with her squad toward the corridor. No one spoke at first. Then, quietly, the soldier beside her muttered, "Respect, Ramirez." His tone was low, but sincere. Another nodded as they walked. "Didn't know." Elena kept her eyes forward, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond. But their words sat with her, a strange mix of comfort and unease. She hadn't told her story to earn respect. She had told it because she had no choice. Yet now, she carried the knowledge that others saw her differently. Later, in the barracks, the chatter returned. Recruits joked, complained about drills, and polished gear for the next day. But Elena noticed glances flicking her way, quick and subtle. Nobody asked outright, not yet. They didn't need to. The commander's pause had told them enough. That night, lying on her bunk, Elena stared at the ceiling. The barracks were dim, the hum of the ventilation system the only constant sound. Around her, her squad mates settled in, some writing letters, others reading. A few drifted quickly into sleep. Elena traced the memory of her father's voice in her mind, the way he had spoken about carrying burdens. She wondered what he would think if he had seen her today, standing in that hall, telling his story before 100 soldiers and a commander. She hoped he would have been proud, but she also knew pride came with responsibility. From now on, she would not only carry her father's memory for herself. Others had heard it, others had seen it, and in some way, that made it bigger. Captain Hayes sat in his office at that same hour, reviewing reports under the dim glow of a desk lamp. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to Ramirez. He had seen many recruits, each carrying their own reasons for being here. But rarely did one reveal so openly the story behind their service. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His own father had served too, though he never spoke of it. Maybe that was why the tattoo had struck him. not the ink itself, but the courage it took to wear memory openly in a place where soldiers were taught to hide personal scars. The commander rubbed his jaw, then set the thought aside. Tomorrow would bring drills, orders, and discipline as always. But he knew something had changed. Ramirez had shown him, and the entire company, that behind the sharp lines of every uniform lay stories deeper than inspections could ever measure. And that thought stayed with him long into the night. Morning drills came early, the sharp call of reveille breaking through the quiet barracks before the sun had fully risen. Soldiers scrambled from their bunks, boots thudding against the floor, uniforms pulled on with mechanical speed. Elena moved. Like the rest, precise and practiced, but the weight of the previous day lingered on her shoulders. By the time they assembled on the field, the air was thick with humidity, the sky streaked with faint orange. Breath plumed in the cool morning air as squads fell into formation, waiting for orders. The previous inspection hadn't been forgotten. Whispers traveled quickly in a place where gossip was currency, and Elena knew her tattoo had become the subject of quiet conversations. Yet no one asked her directly. Soldiers respected boundaries in their own way. Questions were left unspoken, but the looks, respectful, curious, sometimes even admiring, told her enough. The drills were punishing, as they always were. Laps. Around the field, push-ups until arms trembled, sit-ups that burned in the core. Sweat stung Elena's eyes, muscles screaming, but she endured. Each repetition felt like more than training. It was a test of whether she could hold steady under a gaze that had already seen her soul. Captain Hayes paced along the edge of the field, marking corrections, his voice carrying easily across the rows of panting soldiers. His eyes swept over them all, sharp and exact. Yet whenever his gaze passed Elena, there was a flicker, not indulgence, not softness, but acknowledgement. He didn't call her out, didn't ease her burden, but he didn't need to. She felt it. By the time drills ended, the soldiers collapsed onto benches, gulping water like it was gold. Elena wiped sweat from her brow, tying her hair back tighter. A soldier beside her, a lanky recruit named Morgan, leaned closer. "Hey," he said quietly, careful to avoid the ears of others. "Yesterday, that was something." Elena didn't respond right away. She sipped her water, eyes forward. "Respect," he added, his tone sincere. She gave a small nod. "Thanks." It wasn't much, but it was enough. That evening, when the day's duties were finished, Elena sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the small notebook she kept, tucked under her pillow. Inside were sketches of eagles, words her father had once said, and scraps of memory she refused to let fade. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn paper. Her squadmates laughed in the background, a card game unfolding at one table, music playing faintly from a contraband radio someone had smuggled in. But in her corner, Elena felt the weight of memory pressing again. She thought back to her father's funeral, rows of uniforms, a folded flag, her mother's silent tears. Elena had stood rigid then too, even as a teenager, her spine straight as though bracing for a storm. When the bugle had played, the sound had carved itself into her heart. That was the day she had promised herself she would follow in his footsteps. The tattoo had come later, but the decision had been made that day. As she closed the notebook, a shadow fell across her bunk. She looked up to see Captain Hayes standing there. Conversations around the room died instantly. It wasn't common for the commander to enter the barracks unannounced. "Private Ramirez," he said, his voice steady. She stood quickly, snapping to attention. "Sir." He studied her for a moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he gestured slightly. "Walk with." The silence in the barracks deepened. Soldiers pretended not to stare, but their ears strained to catch every word. Elena followed Hayes out into the corridor, the sound of their boots echoing against the concrete. He led her to an empty training room, the kind used for drills in bad weather. The space was quiet, save for the distant hum of the building. Hayes turned to her, folding his arms behind his back. "You answered me yesterday," he said, "but I want to hear it again. Not as part of inspection, as part of who you are." Elena hesitated. "Sir, I told you it's for my father." "Yes," Hayes said, "but I want to understand. You chose to mark your body with something permanent. You chose to carry it in a place you can't see, only feel. That's not casual. That's deliberate." "Why?" Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected this. "Because I never want to forget," she said finally. Hayes's expression softened, just slightly. "You wouldn't forget?" "Not something like that." Helena shook her head. "Memory fades. Faces blur. Time, it takes pieces away. But this," she touched the space between her shoulder blades, "this doesn't fade. It hurts sometimes, even now, but that's part of it. It reminds me that sacrifice isn't clean. It leaves marks." The commander was silent for a long time, his eyes steady on hers. Finally, he nodded. "You're right." Elena blinked, surprised. "My father served too," Hayes said quietly. It was the first time he had ever spoken of himself to a recruit. He came back. But not the same. "There are marks you see, and there are marks you don't. Sometimes I think the invisible ones are heavier." Elena didn't know what to say. For a moment, the distance between commander and recruit blurred, replaced by the simple truth that both were children of soldiers who had left something behind. Hayes straightened again, the steel returning to his posture. "You carry your father with honor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "Yes, sir," Elena said, her voice firmer than she felt. He gave a curt nod, then gestured toward the door. "Back to your unit." As she returned to the barracks, the stares followed her, but she ignored them. Inside, though, something had shifted. For the first time, she felt as though the tattoo was not just her secret burden. It had been acknowledged, respected, even by the one man whose approval carried more weight than any medal. That night, as the barracks settled into quiet, Helena lay awake, the memory of Hayes's words echoing in her mind. "Marks you see, marks you don't." And she wondered how many stories lay hidden beneath the uniforms around her. The days that followed were grueling. Training intensified, as if the instructors were determined to press every ounce of hesitation out of the recruits. Runs lengthened, drills multiplied, and the weight of gear seemed to grow heavier each morning. Sweat and exhaustion became constant companions. Elena pushed through each test, her body aching but her mind sharp. She noticed the subtle shift in the way her squad looked at her. Respect lingered in their glances, not just because of the tattoo, but because she carried herself differently now. She stood taller, her silence no longer just discipline, but purpose. Morgan, the lanky recruit who had spoken after inspection, began keeping pace with her during runs. "You don't even breathe hard," he joked once, panting. "I breathe," Elena replied dryly, but her lips curved into the faintest smile. Others followed suit, not with words, but with actions. They mirrored her posture, her steady pace, her refusal to complain, even when mud clung to every inch of their uniforms. She had never asked to lead, yet without realizing it, she had become a quiet anchor for her squad. One night, during weapons maintenance, conversation drifted as hands worked automatically over rifles. A recruit named Harris glanced at her and spoke. "My brother's name is tattooed on my arm," he said suddenly, pulling up his sleeve to show faded ink. He didn't make it back either. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. For a moment, the others around the table stopped. Elena met his gaze, giving a single nod. "Then you know," she said. Harris nodded back, and that was enough. From that moment, others began to share pieces of their own. Not loudly, not in detail, but fragments slipped through the cracks of exhaustion. A mother who had raised 3 kids alone, a grandfather lost in a war long past, a best friend who never came home from deployment. The tattoo had opened a door, one they all walked through carefully, finding common ground in their hidden scars. Yet Elena still kept the core of her story close. The day of her father's funeral, the sound of the bugle, the folded flag, those belonged to her alone. She had shared enough to honor him, but some memories were too fragile to place in other hands. Captain Hayes, meanwhile, continued to watch from a distance. His commands were as sharp as ever, but occasionally his eyes lingered on Ramirez longer than on others. He saw the way her presence changed the dynamic of her squad, how their shoulders squared differently when she stood beside them. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. One afternoon, after hours of field training, Hayes called her aside again. His tone was casual, but his words carried weight. "You've got influence, Ramirez," he said, "whether you asked for it or not." Elena blinked. "Sir, I'm just doing my part." "That's exactly it," Hayes replied. "The best leaders don't set out to be followed. They just live in a way that others choose to follow." She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. That night, as she lay in her bunk, she thought about his words. Influence, leadership. They weren't titles she had sought, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. She had always believed her father's legacy ended with his death, but perhaps it lived on not just in her, but in those who found strength because she carried him. Her dreams that night were filled with echoes. Her father's voice calling. Her name, the weight of the rifle on her shoulder. The eagle spreading its wings across her back. She woke with her heart racing, but not in fear, in determination. The next day brought a new challenge. A field exercise designed to test endurance, strategy, and cohesion. Squads were sent into the woods with minimal supplies, tasked with navigating to checkpoints while avoiding enemy patrols. It was the kind of exercise that pushed soldiers to their limits, physically and mentally. Elena's squad moved, cautiously through the underbrush, maps in hand, radios crackling softly. The terrain was rough, mud sucking at their boots, branches clawing at their uniforms. Hours passed, fatigue setting in, but Elena's steadiness never wavered. When someone stumbled, she offered a hand. When confusion threatened to slow them, she calmly pointed them back on course. At one point, Morgan muttered, "You're like the compass itself." "Stay focused," Elena replied, though her lips twitched in a small smile. By the end of the exercise, their squad reached the final checkpoint first. Hayes was there, arms folded, watching as they emerged from the trees, sweat-soaked and mud-streaked, but still upright. "Not bad," he said, his voice neutral. But his eyes told another story. Approval, pride, something he rarely displayed. As the squad dispersed, Hayes pulled Elena aside once more. "You carried them through that," he said. "They carried themselves," she replied quickly. "True," Hayes admitted. "But they followed you. Remember that." Elena nodded, but inside, her chest tightened. She hadn't meant to lead. She had only meant to endure, to honor her father, to prove to herself she belonged here. Yet somehow, in the quiet strength she carried, others had found direction. That night, as she sat with her notebook again, she wrote a single sentence. Across a blank page, leadership is carrying weight, even when you don't think you can. It was her father's lesson, but now it was hers too. The barracks were unusually quiet that evening. The sun had dipped low, painting streaks of amber across the windows, and the usual clatter of boots and chatter of soldiers had faded into something more subdued. Elena sat on her bunk, the hum of the ventilation system the only constant background noise. Around her, the squad mates she had trained with for months were unusually silent, each seemingly lost in their own thoughts. It was a shared silence, heavy but not oppressive. It wasn't the kind brought on by fear of punishment or expectation of orders. This was different. This silence was born from understanding, from realizing that behind the crisp uniforms, polished boots, and disciplined postures lay untold stories of sacrifice, loss, and endurance. Morgan, seated beside her on the lower bunk, glanced at her but said nothing. His eyes, however, told her more than words ever could. Respect, recognition, perhaps even awe. The tattoo had become a symbol, not merely of her father, but of every quiet burden that a soldier carried. Across the room, Harris leaned back against the wall, absently tracing the outline of the faded ink on his own arm. He hadn't spoken of his brother in months, but now, in this hush, the memory felt safe enough to surface. The unspoken bond between soldiers, the invisible acknowledgement of shared experience, filled the room more than any words ever could. Elena thought of the morning drills, the long runs, the endless repetitions of push-ups, sit-ups, and formations. Each exertion had tested their bodies, but the past 2 days had tested something deeper, endurance of the heart and spirit. Her story, her tattoo, her willingness to reveal part of her private grief, had resonated with them. In silence, they had all acknowledged it. Captain Hayes's presence had not left their minds either. The man who rarely allowed emotion to surface, who valued precision and discipline above all else, had stopped and listened. Not just that, he had engaged, if only briefly, with the quiet truths of her life. That pause, that acknowledgement, had given the squad permission to recognize the humanity in themselves and in one another. That evening, as they prepared for the next day's training, Elena noticed subtle shifts in their routines. Boots were polished, uniforms aligned, yes, but there was an ease in their movements that hadn't been there before. Heads lifted higher, shoulders squared with purpose rather than fear. Glances exchanged that communicated understanding without speaking. They had absorbed her story, and in doing so, found a way to honor their own. Elena herself felt the weight of her father's legacy differently now. Before, it had been a private responsibility, a silent promise etched in ink and memory. But with Hayes's acknowledgement, with the quiet respect of her peers, she realized her legacy had extended beyond her own body. It had seeped into the lives of those around her, shaping their perception of strength, courage, and endurance. She thought back to the day she first saw the tattoo in the mirror of the small shop. Pain had burned down her spine as the needle etched each line, but it had been purposeful pain. She had chosen to endure it as a testament to memory, to love, and to resilience. Now, that choice had gained a new dimension. It was a bridge between her past and the present, between one soldier's grief and another's understanding. Later that night, as the barracks settled into deeper quiet, Elena lay awake on her bunk. She traced the air with her fingers, imagining the outline of the eagle across her spine, the Roman numerals beneath it. Every line of ink represented a story, a sacrifice, a memory, and every story had now been acknowledged. Somewhere in the quiet, she heard the soft rustle of another soldier turning in the bunk above her. It was small, almost imperceptible, but to her, it was significant. She wasn't alone in carrying loss. Others had felt it, had lived it, had survived it. And in this shared acknowledgement, they had found strength. Her thoughts drifted back to Captain Hayes. His words from the previous day echoed in her mind. Marks you see, marks you don't. They were more than just a reflection of the physical ink or the scars left by battle. They were also about the invisible marks left on hearts and spirits, the enduring weight of memory, the unseen burdens that soldiers bore silently, and the courage it took to carry them forward. Elena understood finally that the silence in the barracks was not emptiness. It was a dialogue of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared human experience. Each soldier, in their own way, had been listening, observing. They hadn't spoken, yet the message was clear: we see you. We understand. We honor. The next morning, the squad moved into the training field with a quiet cohesion that hadn't been present before. Each step, each maneuver, each adjustment of gear carried the weight of yesterday's recognition. Elena's presence became a guiding force, not because she demanded leadership, but because she embodied endurance and authenticity. Her peers responded instinctively, trusting her example, following her steady pace through the grueling exercise. At one point during a particularly exhausting navigation drill, Harris stumbled in the mud, a sharp cry of frustration escaping his lips. Elena immediately extended a hand, steadying him. Morgan and the others hesitated for a split second before helping as well. The action was simple, almost mundane, yet it reflected the shared understanding that had grown quietly over the past days. They were no longer just individuals completing drills. They were a unit bonded by experience, empathy, and recognition. By the end of the day, the squad had completed the exercises faster and with fewer errors than any group had in recent weeks. Captain Hayes observed from the sidelines, his expression neutral as always, yet his eyes lingered on Ramirez longer than anyone else. He didn't speak, didn't offer praise aloud, but his observation, silent and calculated, reinforced the unspoken hierarchy of respect that had formed. Later, as the squad returned to the barracks, Alana felt a sense of fulfillment she had not anticipated. The tattoo on her back, once a solitary symbol of private grief, had become a catalyst for unity, understanding, and resilience within her squad. She had unwittingly fostered an environment where the invisible burdens of each soldier could be acknowledged without words, where the quiet strength of one could inspire the endurance of all. That night, Elena opened her notebook again. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate. Shared silence is louder than the harshest command. It teaches, it binds, it transforms. The ink dried across the page as she lay back, staring at the ceiling. The barracks were hushed, but the quiet was alive. It was full of recognition, empathy, and the unspoken truth that soldiers, beneath their uniforms and discipline, carried stories that demanded acknowledgement. For the first time, Elena felt that her own story, the story of her father, the tattoo, and her private grief, had transcended her own experience. It had become part of something larger, something communal. And in that shared silence, she realized that strength was not only in endurance, but in connection, in the courage to reveal and acknowledge truths without fanfare or ceremony. The eagle on her back seemed to lift slightly, wings spread wide, as if it too recognized the transformation. Roman numerals beneath it were no longer just a marker of loss, but a symbol of resilience passed silently from one generation to another, from one soldier to all those who now understood what it meant to carry weight, seen and unseen. The morning fog clung to the training fields like a thin veil, muting the sharp outlines of trees and equipment. Soldiers moved with practiced precision, rifles slung, boots squelching in the damp earth. The air was cold, carrying the tang of mud and sweat. Elena's squad fell into formation, their movements synchronized, each step measured. Yet beneath the surface of routine, something deeper had taken hold. The respect that had grown quietly over the past days was no longer subtle. It manifested in glances, in the instinctive way her peers followed her lead, in the absence of hesitation when she issued directions. Elena did not speak loudly, nor did she demand compliance. She simply moved with the certainty that comes from understanding one's purpose. And others moved in tandem, trusting not her rank, but her steadiness, her resilience, and the story she carried silently on her back. Captain Hayes observed from the edge of the field. He rarely offered commentary during exercises unless there was a blatant error. But this time, his presence was more than oversight. It was observation with intent. He noticed the unspoken cohesion, the way Elena's squad seemed to function as one organism rather than a collection of individuals. That cohesion was a rare commodity, difficult to teach, and it had grown naturally around her. The exercise was brutal. They navigated obstacle courses designed to test endurance, teamwork, and quick thinking. Mud-covered walls, swinging ropes, and water-filled trenches pushed each soldier to their limits. Yet Elena moved steadily, taking falls in stride, helping others without hesitation, offering guidance with a quiet confidence that demanded attention, without command. During a particularly grueling portion of the course, Harris stumbled, catching only partially on a rope and scraping his knee. Elena was immediately beside him, steadying him and assessing the injury. Without pause, she instructed Morgan to help steady his pack and guided Harris to regain his footing. The squad followed naturally, without need for further direction. It was the embodiment of leadership in its purest form, influence through presence, not authority. By the time the squad reached the final checkpoint, they were exhausted, drenched, and covered in mud. Yet their movements were precise, coordinated, and efficient. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his boots leaving dark impressions in the wet ground. His eyes scanned the group, finally settling on Elena. "Private Ramirez," he said, his tone measured, almost neutral. "Your squad performed exceptionally. Take note, others." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the other squads. Hayes rarely used her name publicly. That he had done so now carried significance beyond the words themselves. Elena's face remained calm, though her chest swelled slightly. She didn't need verbal praise to validate her efforts, yet she recognized the weight in his acknowledgement. It was more than recognition of skill. It was respect for character, for endurance, for the quiet strength she embodied. After the exercise, as soldiers returned to the barracks, Hayes called Elena aside once more. The corridor was quieter than usual, the echoes of boots less jarring in the humid morning air. Hayes's eyes met hers with a weight that conveyed more than inspection ever could. "You've changed the dynamic of your unit," he said. "Not through orders, not through rank, but through presence. Do you understand what that means?" Elena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good," Hayes said. He hesitated, a rare softness appearing in his expression. Leadership isn't something granted by title. It's earned by those who carry weight willingly, even when they believe no one is watching. You've earned it, Ramirez. Do not let it slip away. Her mind flashed back to the tattoo on her back, the eagle, the Roman numerals, the memory of her father. All of it had shaped her, and now it had shaped others around her. The quiet legacy she carried in ink had become visible through her actions, and Hayes recognized that. Later, in the evening, Elena sat on her bunk and reviewed the day in her mind. She thought about each soldier who had looked to her instinctively. During the exercise, each movement coordinated without explicit instruction, each glance of trust that passed silently between them. Her father's words echoed softly. Strength is measured by endurance, not victories. She realized that the endurance she embodied had become a bridge between generations, experiences, and lives. The barracks were alive with quiet discussion. Soldiers swapped stories, laughed, and repaired their gear. Yet when her squad gathered, there was a subtle reverence in their interactions. Elena did not demand attention, yet it followed her naturally. She guided without instruction, inspired without words, and her presence commanded respect in a way no metal could. Hayes observed this transformation quietly over the next few days. In the strict, disciplined world of the military, respect earned this way was rare. Many followed rules, but few inspired instinctive trust and cohesion. Ramirez had done both, and Hayes recognized that her influence would shape the squad for months, perhaps years. That evening, as the barracks lights dimmed and soldiers settled into sleep, Elena wrote again in her notebook. This time, the words flowed easily, capturing the essence of the past week. Respect is not demanded. It grows from endurance, empathy, and the courage to carry what others cannot see. Her hand paused over the final line. The eagle inked across her back seemed to shift in her imagination, wings spreading wider, Roman numerals glowing softly in memory. She smiled faintly, knowing that the symbol of her father's legacy had now become something more, a living emblem of guidance, courage, and shared strength. Sleep came slowly, thoughts lingering on the day's lessons. She realized that the quiet respect her squad showed her was not mere deference to a peer. It was acknowledgement of shared humanity, a bond that transcended orders and inspections. Each soldier, in their own way, had recognized the strength it took to endure grief, to honor memory, and to carry forward both without complaint. In that quiet night, Elena understood the full weight of what she had inherited and what she had given. Her father's sacrifice, once private and solitary, had become a catalyst for cohesion, courage, and unity. It had inspired others to reflect on their own stories, to acknowledge the invisible scars that shaped their lives, and to see leadership as more than authority, as a living, breathing presence that guided through example and quiet endurance. By morning, the squad had already begun to carry the lessons forward. Drills continued, commands were obeyed, and exercises tested both physical and mental limits. But beneath it all, the invisible thread of respect and trust connected each soldier. Elena's quiet leadership had become a stabilizing force, and Hayes observed it with careful attention, knowing that such transformations were both rare and invaluable. The tattoo on her spine was no longer simply a memorial. It had become a symbol not only of a father's sacrifice, but of resilience, influence, and the subtle power of enduring strength. It reminded her daily that leadership was not about orders, accolades, or visibility. It was about carrying weight willingly, inspiring those around you through example, and leaving a legacy that endured beyond personal memory. The final days of training approached like a storm's calm before the chaos. Exercises grew longer, simulations more complex, and expectations higher. Every soldier knew that what they had endured in the past weeks would culminate in a final assessment, a test of cohesion, endurance, and individual resilience. Yet beneath the sweat and gritted teeth, something deeper had taken root. Elena could feel it, the invisible bond that connected her squad, each of them moving in harmony without the need for constant direction. Captain Hayes watched from the yaw. Sidelines, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral, yet intense. Today's exercise was designed to push every soldier to the brink, a multi-day field simulation that combined navigation, survival, and tactical exercises. Recruits would have to rely on themselves and each other, making decisions under fatigue and stress. For most, it was grueling. For Elena's squad, it was a proving ground. As the exercise began, Elena's movements were precise, her voice calm. When directions were necessary, her presence steady and grounding. The squad flowed around her like water, each member instinctively responding to challenges, hazards, and obstacles. Where others faltered under fatigue or confusion, her squad remained coordinated, moving as a unit. Her influence had become the invisible framework holding them together. At one point, a simulated ambush tested their cohesion. Shouts rang across the field, smoke and obstacles obscuring vision. Soldiers fell back and regrouped, but Elena's squad maintained formation. She moved to the center, issuing clear, concise guidance. Harris, exhausted and muddy, followed her lead without question. Morgan mirrored her movements instinctively. Each soldier relied on her presence, not out of obligation, but out of trust and respect earned over weeks of shared trials. Captain Hayes observed, noting subtle nuances in movement, coordination, and decision-making. Elena's squad completed the ambush scenario without error, demonstrating an efficiency and cohesion rarely seen. He scribbled notes, his usually impassive face betraying a hint of approval. This was not the result of rank, orders, or brute force. It was the culmination of character, influence, and silent leadership. When the final simulation ended, the squad regrouped, mud-soaked and exhausted, yet upright and composed. Hayes stepped forward, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Silence fell over the group as he surveyed the unit. He didn't need to speak loudly. His presence commanded attention. "Private Ramirez," he began, using her full name deliberately. "Your performance, and that of your squad, has been exceptional. Not just in execution, but in cohesion and morale. Leadership is not granted by rank or title alone. It is earned, demonstrated through consistency, courage, and the ability to inspire others. You have earned it." Elena's chest tightened. She had never sought recognition. Her tattoo, her father's memory, had been a private anchor. Yet here, in the culmination of weeks of training, it had indirectly guided others, shaping their confidence and unity. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Hayes continued, addressing the entire company now. "Observe and learn. There is more to leadership than orders. There is endurance, presence, and the quiet strength that commands respect naturally. Let this be a lesson to you all." The soldiers looked at Elena with a mixture of admiration and acknowledgement. Her quiet influence, once invisible to many, had now been publicly recognized. It was not boastful, not performative. It was earned and deserved. That evening, back in the barracks, Elena sat alone for a moment, reflecting. The tattoo across her spine had always symbolized her father's sacrifice, a personal memory carried silently. Now it had become more, a symbol of endurance, influence, and legacy. Her private grief had transformed into a source of guidance for others. She traced her fingers lightly over her back, imagining the eagle spreading its wings wider than an eye. Ever, Roman numerals glowing faintly with the weight of memory. Morgan approached quietly, holding a notebook. He handed it to her without words. Inside were sketches, notes, and reflections, tributes from her squad, inspired by the lessons they had observed from her example. Her private story had sparked a collective recognition of resilience, courage, and quiet leadership. Harris joined them, nodding. "You didn't just carry yourself," he said softly. "You carried us too." Elena blinked, overwhelmed. She had never intended to be a leader. She had intended only to endure, to honor a father she lost too soon, and to prove to herself that she belonged. Yet through quiet strength, empathy, and perseverance, she had become the foundation of her squad's unity. Later that night, she recorded her final entry in her notebook. "Legacy is not what you inherit alone. It is what you carry forward in those you touch, those who watch, and those who follow. Strength is shared. Leadership is earned silently, not demanded openly. Memory endures in actions, not just in ink." As the barracks settled into a soft, purposeful quiet, Elena lay back, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts wandered to her father, to Captain Hayes, and to the squad whose respect she had earned through nothing more than endurance and quiet authenticity. The eagle across her back seemed to lift in her imagination, wings wide, carrying the weight of memory and the promise of legacy forward. In the days that followed, Elena's influence continued to ripple outward. Recruits looked to her example, not for orders, but for guidance. Hayes observed, confident that her presence would continue to shape the unit long after the current training cycle ended. The tattoo, once a private emblem of grief and remembrance, had become a symbol of leadership, courage, and endurance, tangible proof that strength carried in silence could inspire far beyond oneself. By the final morning of the training cycle, Elena's squad stood together, boots polished, uniforms precise, yet their strength was deeper than appearance. They had endured, learned, and grown, guided quietly by one member's resolve. Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying across the formation. Remember this: leadership, courage, and legacy are earned every day, in every action, in every choice to endure. Private Ramirez has demonstrated this beyond measure. Take note and carry it forward. Elena met his gaze, acknowledging the weight of his words. She knew that her journey was far from over, that every day would bring challenges and decisions that tested endurance, character, and resolve. Yet she also knew that her father's memory, the lessons etched in ink on her spine, and the influence she now wielded through presence and example, would guide her and those around her in ways unseen but profoundly felt. As the company moved out to begin the next phase of training, Elena felt a quiet pride. She had not sought recognition, not demanded authority. She had endured, remembered, and embodied the lessons of her past. In doing so, she had inspired others, forged bonds, and left a mark deeper than any visible medal or commendation. Her father's legacy, once private, had become a living testament to the enduring power of quiet strength. And in the depths of her back, beneath the fabric of her uniform, the eagle spread its wings, Roman numerals standing as silent sentinels, reminding her, and now all who witnessed her journey, that courage, endurance, and legacy are carried forward, quietly but powerfully, in every step, every action, every heartbeat. The story had begun with a tattoo, a moment of silent grief, and a pause by a commander's gaze. It ended in recognition, unity, and the undeniable truth that the strength to carry burdens, honor memory, and inspire others' lives not in declarations, but in the quiet, consistent, and enduring actions of those who choose to endure.